This is Relationscapes, the podcast where we survey the terrain of identity and connection, where we believe culture, not just chromosomes, defines who we are. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and our guide in this episode is anthropologist Matthew Gutmann.
Okay, we're animals, and so what? What does that actually mean? It could mean that we're all going off instinct and, oh, the hell with it. I'll just go along with whatever feels good because I'm an animal, and what are you going to do? Why do we still allow that? Oh, he's a guy. Come on, what do you expect? It's really not healthy.
Matthew Gutmann argues that male behavior isn't carved in stone. It's not hardwired into our DNA. Men don't act the way they do just because biology demands it, but because culture shapes it. And to prove this, he went global, studying fatherhood patterns in Mexico City, marriage markets in Shanghai, college campuses in the United States, and what Matthew found is simple but powerful. Masculinity is not fixed. It looks different across different times and places. It looks different even within the same time, in the same places. That's why we can't settle for dangerous cliches like men are animals or boys will be boys. Gutmann reminds us men are more than testosterone and Y chromosomes. They're shaped as much by society as by biology. And rethinking masculinity this way isn't just about men. It's about building healthier lives for everyone. Gutmann joins us right now to talk about his new book, Are Men Animals? Matthew Gutmann, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks for having me.
One of the reasons you wrote this book was because we see these headlines pop up. It seems like they pop up every month, or maybe even every week, these pop culture science headlines. There's an example in your book from 2018. In Newsweek, it says, men who like jazz music have less testosterone than those who like rock. What goes through your mind when you see a headline like that?
I want to know where the study comes from.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the people doing the research made no such claims. The people doing the research talked to a few people in Japan and decided that that was representative of the few people that they talked to in Japan. But the press got a hold of it, and all of a sudden, these few people at a university in Japan, these few guys, became representative of all men, all places on Earth. And what it did is it fit into stereotypes, the pre-existing stereotypes, and they thought, oh, now we have science to prove our pre-existing stereotypes.
And you say that people kind of appreciate tidy explanations too, right? It takes a really complicated thing about gender and masculinity and music and hormones and all of this and ties it up with this nice little bow that says, if you like jazz music, maybe you're kind of less manly because rock is rock.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make fun of people who are looking for simple explanations. I think that's a great thing to do. The problem is whether the simple explanations are accurate or not, or whether they, in fact, reflect some deep-seated confusion on our part, and getting out of that confusion may be a little more difficult. So that, if genes can explain something to you in a simple way, you may use genes to explain human behavior in some way. But let me just give you an example. 100 years ago, how many people in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives were women? Zero.
None.
Okay. This was representative of parliaments and governing bodies all over the world. There were a few queens here and there, but basically women were not political leaders. And if you'd asked anybody 100 years ago, why was this the case? People would say, look, women have a lot of strengths, but they don't make good political leaders by nature. By nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be hard to refute that because for thousands of years, you hadn't seen political leaders as women. Now, in the last 100 years, that's changed dramatically. And all of a sudden, anybody who runs around saying women don't make political leaders will have to check out the last person who got elected president of Mexico and a bunch of other countries. So that kind of idea, that naturalizing of what exists today or what you think exists today is very common, and it takes a while to work it out.
And for you, I mean, as a scholar, as a researcher, you obviously are drawn to scientific ideas and the scientific method and sort of empirical analysis and all of this, but you also caution against placing unreasonable trust in biological explanations, in particular of male behavior. That's what this book is about. What is that unreasonable trust coming from, do you think? I mean, that's kind of a speculative question, I know, but like when you think about the fact that there is that unreasonable trust, where's that coming from, do you think?
Look, I think that scientists are not robots. Scientists grow up in and are affected by the prejudices of the age in which they live. They're not immune either. That doesn't mean that we can't trust anything scientists say, but it does mean that we don't automatically accept what scientists say, and especially the case when you have scientists disagreeing among themselves over the same evidence. That's great. That just is more fertile room for discovery and trying to figure things out. I think the point is that doesn't let us off the hook. Simply because you heard a scientist say X, Y, or Z doesn't make it automatically true. It doesn't make it false either. I don't want to fall into the people who naysay scientists all over the place.
Right.
That's crazy and very, very dangerous often. But I'm just saying that if you have science saying, as scientists did run around saying 50 years ago, maybe not as well as 100, but as recently as 50, that women should not be political leaders because when they have their periods, they are out of control, or they can be out of control. This was said, for instance, famously by the doctor of Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president and then presidential candidate. So, this doctor, the man of science, was making these statements that it would be a horror show to have a woman in charge of a company, much less the government.
No, you'll still hear people talking about that. Like, we don't want a woman having access to the nuclear codes because, men, we need a rational man, as though there's this distinction about like rational brain men and irrational emotion hormone women.
Exactly. And I think what I've been trying to look at, especially in this book, is the fact that we have been critiquing and taking apart the biobabble with respect to women and women's bodies, that they automatically determine X, Y, or Z. They don't. But we haven't done the same with men. And it's very easy still, I think, at least in the United States, Mexico, and many other parts of the world, to toss out the word testosterone. Most of us wouldn't know testosterone if we tripped over it. But it's an easy kind of catchphrase. We throw it in.
I'm told that I'm bald because of it. Is that?
Well, see, that might have something to do with it.
Maybe.
But whether you are a pacifist or a very aggressive person won't tell me anything necessarily about your average level of testosterone. But it's very common if you hear when Brett Kavanaugh was being nominated for the Supreme Court. All sorts of people were coming out and saying, hey, what do you expect? A high school kid has all this testosterone running through him. What high school boy hasn't wanted to rape a girl? That to me is incredibly dangerous kind of thinking. First of all, it's false. Most teenage boys do not rape girls. Second of all, testosterone does not automatically cause anyone to rape. What causes people to rape are social factors, not biological ones.
Yeah, and we'll unpack those a little bit later, but the main point that you're making here is that you want to avoid what you call biological extremism about males, the idea that we can sum up male behavior scientifically according to things like hormones, according to things like genes, and that we can explain male behavior based on those things. And you say it's dangerous because it kind of takes away control. It means that can we really be upset about a teenage boy assaulting someone if their body made them do it, right? And you say this can be a problem for people who would excuse a Brett Kavanaugh and say, well, this is boys will be boys. But it can also be dangerous for people who say all men are predators, or that like we all need to be afraid of all men, or so it can come from multiple angles, right? That this biological extremism can both excuse male behavior or make it seem inevitable and just like pressing on everybody.
Right. And then what we have to do is control these natural impulses of all males of the species. And that's where the comparison with non-human animals comes in, because there are obviously males of other species that behave in certain ways. And if we say, oh, that's what all males of all species tend to do, then what we're doing is saying it is the maleness of this particular animal, whether it's human or not, that makes them do various things. And the fact is that human biology is more flexible than that of any other animal on Earth. And so you have a range of behavior, you have a range of emotions, you have a range of all sorts of things that you don't find in any other animals. Not to say that there aren't emotions with other animals, not to say that there aren't behaviors that look similar, but I would argue that if you see a group of female baboons and a single male baboon, it's wrong to say that that group of females is a harem.
Yeah, you're using English language, yeah.
A harem is a human institution in certain cultures, and most people who talk about harems have not a clue. With baboons, they don't have a clue what a human harem looks like, except in some male fantasy.
Yeah. We'll unpack that more from your chapter, Monkey See, Human Do, a little bit later on. But the two main points then that we're going to be talking about are that biological extremism about males is sort of nonsense, and also that believing that males can't really control themselves is hazardous. We'll address both of those more as we go, but I do want to take a second to talk about method, because you're coming from the field of anthropology, and people might not be familiar with that. So let's talk about that field and the tools that you're going to use to answer the question about whether men are just animals. So talk about anthropology for a second.
So anthropology is a broad discipline in the social sciences. It really runs the gamut from people who are much more scientific and do quantitative kind of research, number crunching, surveys and whatnot, to people at the other extreme, and I'm more at the other extreme, and that is we look for stories, human lives, and we try to understand those human lives and portray them in our writings and our teaching. And so what I end up doing, and what I've ended up doing, is spending thousands of hours with not that many people in various places. And I look and I see how representative they might be in various kinds of ways. But I'm not looking to interview 1,000 people for half an hour or an hour each. I want to get to know a few people very, very well. And this is qualitative research called ethnography. And it means that you go very, very deep in a particular community or a particular group of people, and you try to see how, for instance, I've been looking in Mexico at changes between men and women in what fathers and mothers do with children of various ages, and how that's changed over generations of time. And you do that by spending time with people, not simply by asking them, how much time do you do this? How much time do you do that? You actually are there with them, whether they're changing diapers, whether they're helping the kids with homework, whether they're doing whatever along those lines. And so I've done a similar thing. You end up spending a lot of time talking to people in various kinds of contexts. But again, the idea is to go deep rather than superficially broad.
I love the way you put it. At one point in the book, you say you're asking philosophical questions and you're thinking not just about birth and death, but about conception and funeral. So birth and death, birth and conception, death and funeral. So you're looking at the stories around human existence. You're studying patterns of human behavior to understand more about what it means to be human, not just in the nuts and bolts of birth and death, but also in the cultural meaning and experience in conceptions and funerals. That sums it up really well. And let's talk about your first chapter with that in mind. It's about gender confusion. And this is a phrase that I've actually heard thrown around to attack trans folks, that they're experiencing gender confusion. You're taking that term back to say, actually, the way that we're thinking of gender in these extremely binary and rigid ways is kind of the source of the confusion itself. So talk about how you're using that phrase, gender confusion, and what you're trying to do in this chapter.
Well, first of all, I would say that they stole that phrase from us, the anti-trans people. I mean, the fact is you can go back and look at a very famous play called Angels in America by Tony Kushner.
Kushner, yeah.
He uses the phrase gender confusion in that play when he's talking about things. That is that some people, I've heard other interviews you've done, and you identify yourself as a cis hetero male.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I would identify myself as similarly. And on the screen I'm looking at, you use he, him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I do too. But I have a kid who uses they.
Mm-hmm.
One of my kids uses they, and that's because they are not comfortable with other kinds of pronouns being used in this case, because they're not comfortable in a simple I am a man, I am a woman.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the kind of world that they exist in and want to exist in. So I think that a lot of people are challenging old-fashioned notions. At the same time, you have a huge pushback from the Vatican and from right-wing folks in every country on earth saying, on the contrary, it's a biological,
Mm-hmm.
and in the case of the Vatican, they say it's not only biological, they say it's a God-given fact. There's man, there's woman, and don't go trying to screw things up.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that people live a different way than man, woman. Some people do.
Mm-hmm.
And either we acknowledge this and appreciate it and respect it and help to build a society in which they are comfortable and can thrive as not a man, not a woman, or we are doing tremendous harm to a huge number of people in the population. So the gender confusion, I think, is real. And the struggles around this, the renegotiation, are also real. The fact is, who would have thought 20 years ago that abortion could be illegal again in the United States? These are forces, powerful forces in the United States who are pushing in a direction to go back to a situation in which a lot of things were not legal anymore. And I think all sorts of things like gay marriage is on the line,
Mm-hmm.
contraception is on the line. There's all sorts of things that many of us have unfortunately too much taken for granted. So I think it's part of a gender confusion, but it's a heightened period of time in history, as far as I can see. And we need to be vigilant, and we need to be really analyzing these things and struggling to advance a broader concept of what gender and sexuality can mean.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because your chapter makes it clear that the direction of change isn't preordained. Societies aren't necessarily moving in the same direction to this more enlightened or accepting or progressive place that we're all going to arrive at, but rather things go back and forth. And as anthropology as a field has shown in so many studies, that human ideas about sex and gender vary over time and across culture. So even for people who don't want to maybe open their minds about non-binary folks or trans folks, the fact is that what it means to be a man or a woman has greatly varied in history and also across cultures, which you draw out in your book. You also mentioned religious and scientific components, and that's important too, because some people might think that it's just old-timey religion or prejudice that would lock into a gender binary, that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or whatever, that kind of thing. But you also point out that some scientific-minded folks have locked into rigid ideas. And in your book, you trace the rise of sociobiology in the 20th century that played a huge role in scientifically justifying conservative gender roles. So maybe take a second to talk about sociobiology as a force and what that suggests to you about how we think about gender today.
Well, sociobiology really developed in the 1970s in the United States, and it spoke to a population more broadly, including among scientists, who wanted to reduce things to genes and chromosomes, evolution, heredity, things like this, and felt very comfortable explaining, for instance, rape. That rape was simply a manifestation of men trying to spread their seed and impregnate as many females as they could in order for their genes to be more powerful in the world. This, however, never explains sex between men. It doesn't explain rape of girls who are not going to get pregnant or older women who are not going to get pregnant. There are huge and obvious gaps, but nonetheless, there are people who continue to rely on these biological explanations. At the same time, there are other scientists Anne Fausto Sterling is one of the great examples of a biologist who's worked very seriously on questions of sex. And she says, look, if you're talking about primary sexual traits like genitalia, that does tend to be a little more binary in terms of the biology. But when you're starting to talk about secondary sexual traits, body hair, things like that, it is all over the map. So it's very important that we not get locked into some kind of binary thinking, including biologically. It's not just that we don't want to sort of think socially or culturally along those lines, but even biology itself is much more confusing. There are kids who were born with what are called ambiguous genitalia as well. And the doctors, because they grew up in the same society that you and I did, often feel that they have an obligation to make an arbitrary choice. This will be a female, this will be a male, and they do reconstructive surgery on infants. It should be criminalized.
Which by the way, none of the bills that are fighting trans care for youth are addressing that fact. They're letting that go.
Good point.
It's locking in the binary. Now, sociobiology is an important concept because it's trying to read what it means to be human based on biology, based on the body. And you talk about these two competing ideas. Number one, that a human body determines what a human person is going to be. So if someone has a penis, they're male. If they have a vulva, they're female. And then you mentioned intersex folks, which complicates that. There's also like chromosomal difference. There's all sorts of differences where even the binary biologically breaks down, right? But largely sexually dimorphic. Like the numbers seem to fall around like generally male, female biology with important exceptions. But sociobiology means we wanted to say if that biology is that way, then human experience and people need to be that way. So there's that idea that human body is determinate. Then there's this other idea that society and culture is determinative. So a social construction idea of gender, which is actually what it means to be a man or woman, male or female, doesn't necessarily tie to the physical body as much as the society and culture and the expectations around it. And these two competing ideas, you say, have held sway at different periods of time. And the chapter is so helpful in showing how sociobiology wanted to identify what it meant to be a man. It started off with genitals. Do they have a penis, right? Bodies. Then it kind of shifted to hormones. You mentioned testosterone. Then it moved to genes, which is chromosomes. And we still see people today who oppose trans rights and want to challenge trans identities, still trying to find a scientific way to do this, whether it be through bodies, hormones, or genes. The history you lay out there is really helpful in showing how sociobiology has tried to construct what it means to be a man based on physical bodies.
Look, and you have in every single population that you can talk about, you have people who are very firm. I am a woman. I experience life as a woman, and I have no problem identifying myself as a woman. That may be a gay woman. That may be a heterosexual woman. That may be, a trans woman. That may be all sorts of different kinds of women. At the same time, you may be trans and you say, I don't identify strongly with either male or female, just as you could be heterosexual and not want to identify in these kinds of ways. What strikes me as important here, though, is it's not like biology is fixed and what changes is culture and society around this fixed biology, because you find biology changing also, and you find our understanding of biology changing. Two examples. One, pornography. I had an unpleasant experience years ago in an argument with somebody who told me, look, you study gender and you think a lot of it's cultural difference and not biological. I would go along with you to a certain extent. But the fact is there are some fundamental differences between males and females. For example, visual stimulation. Men are visually stimulated much more than women. Therefore, that's why men look at porn and women don't. Important to note that this argument was in 1996, before the internet had taken off, and the fact is that pornography was still something that you bought in a store, that you went to a cinema downtown, a CD cinema downtown, and you didn't watch in the privacy of your own home. Once it became available, as everybody now knows, not all women, not all men, But there are millions and millions of women who also watch porn, and it turns out that visual stimulation was not a biological difference. But it was impossible to prove that to some of the scientists then, because they said, how could you explain this otherwise? How you explain it is stigma. The other example has to do with epigenetics, and I'm not a biologist, but the fact is that the field of epigenetics within biology today is booming, and it shows things like environmental factors that can actually change biology. And then there's debate over whether those changed biologies can be inherited by the offspring of those animals, human or otherwise, who've been affected by the environment.
Like an example that might be, and I'm not saying this is exactly true, but like going back to the jazz music thing, maybe listening to jazz music has a calming effect. And if you're like drawn to that, your levels of testosterone might be affected by, there are things that you do. Or another example I think of that another guest talked about is taxi drivers have this really huge part of their brain that's bigger than other people's that kind of deals with directions and stuff. And it's like, oh, did they become taxi drivers because they had these huge pieces of the brain that get directions? Or is the repetition and like knowledge of their job affecting their biology and like actually changing their bodies?
I think in the case of jazz, I'm not sure that would work there. I think it had a lot more to do with racism and African Americans being associated with jazz and white people being associated with rock.
Yes. And like what strength is, right? Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an important caveat, but that's the idea. I think the taxi driver one,
Malnutrition can have a direct impact on biology, not only body size and body health, but brain size and brain function. So that how does this affect? How does poverty affect people?
Racism and the corrosive effects on the physical body that it can have. There's a lot of examples of this. Now, you cite Joyce Carol Oates here, this idea of nature mysticism, to really drive home why this matters. And it matters because people endow scientific conclusions with moral weight. We want to actually figure out what's right and wrong based on what biology is supposedly telling us. And so transphobic folks might say, oh, if science tells us this, then it is morally problematic and wrong, even. Not just like scientifically wrong to be trans, but actually there's a moral element to this. And so this idea of nature mysticism that you borrow from Joyce Carol Oates is really important to point out how we're drawing moral evaluations off of supposed scientific conclusions.
Absolutely. I think, there's one Oxford scientist who writes that Wall Street is the epitome of testosterone because you have to have high testosterone levels to be able to be successful on Wall Street. So to me, this is drawing, and this is a positive thing in his view. There's absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever, but it fits into a pre-existing idea and a moral universe in which making a lot of money is necessarily good, and therefore it makes testosterone and higher levels of testosterone automatically good because that's what leads you to making more money than other people with lower levels of testosterone, particularly women, but also, lesser men.
There's a term that you introduced, bioskepticism, and I just want to define that really quick before we move on to the next chapter. And bioskepticism is you're not asking people to be against science or completely skeptical of science or anti-biology or anything like that, or to ignore expert wisdom. What you're inviting people to do with bioskepticism is to challenge the idea that everything can best be explained by biology without other considerations. So questions like how sexuality and mating work, questions about violence and aggression, questions about nurturing and fostering of children or other people. You're saying, let's have some bioskepticism and not just make the story about how all those things work a story of just biology without other considerations. Is that a fair way to describe bioskepticism?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because I think that what we are aiming for, most of us in the social scientists, certainly, most researchers, is an integration of biology and culture and society and all these kinds of things. It's not an either or. It's not that one is a tabula rasa and then everything else can change or not change. But how do these things evolve in concert with each other? So it's obviously we are animals. And to me, that was the hardest part of the book. It's sort of like okay, we're
Mm-hmm.
animals. And so what?
Mm-hmm.
What does that actually mean for humans to be animals? Well, it could mean that we just have instinct and we're all going off instinct and we really don't have that much will to control what we do. And oh, the hell with it. I'll just go along with, whatever feels good.
Yeah, got to live with it.
I'll live with it because I'm an animal, and what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fought very hard against that kind of notion that, oh, she's a woman. That's why she's doing whatever she's doing. That is regarded as a sexist kind of analysis in many quarters. Why do we still allow that? Oh, he's a guy.
Yeah.
Come on, what do you expect? That to me is, okay, I've done it too, you've done it
It's
too.
fatalist, yeah.
But it's really not healthy.
No, because it can excuse anything or just give us a sense of like, why try? Why even resist?
Exactly.
That's Matthew Gutmann. We're talking about the book, Are Men Animals? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short. Let's get into some more specifics here now. Humans are animals in a sense, and this comparison only increased after Darwin. We see ourselves as descendants of the monkey people, some monkey people. And now we've got the common animal comparisons that come up with men, and these are problematic. And you actually point out that if we look more closely, even at ape ancestors or kind of how the animal kingdom works, even if we wanted that to be like a great comparison, it's actually not. Like there are examples in the animal kingdom that would contradict some of the stereotypes about men. Maybe if you have an example you can think of some monkeys that we might look to and say, oh, wow, that does challenge what we think.
So the classic comparison is done with between humans and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees basically alpha male led in terms of there tends to be an alpha male who it has much more power and control over the rest. There's a lot of fighting that goes on among the males and whatnot. Well, there are researchers like Franz de Waal who recently died, who did brilliant research on another group of primates called the bonobos, or sometimes they're called the bonobos. Both pronunciations are fine. And it turns out that we and the chimps and the bonobos all split from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago, meaning that if you want to do a comparison, we're just as close, evolutionarily speaking, to the bonobos, who are alpha female led by and large, who spend a great deal of time in all sorts of intricate ways having sex with each other and themselves.
Yeah.
And yet we hear about the chimps and, hey, these guys are fighting all the time. Hey, they're led by a male. Hey, that's natural. That's evolution.
What do you expect?
Why don't we talk about the bonobos? Well, the bonobos come along and, well, they're led by females. Well, they have a lot of sex, and especially when there's a conflict, they end up resolving it not through fighting very often, but through having sex. It's a different approach, but why aren't we? I mean, it's also problematic to say we're like the bonobos. No, this was 6 million years ago, and we've all gone through a lot of changes. It's not like the bonobos and the chimps today are the same as our ancient ancestors 6 million years ago. They've also evolved in different directions. So there is a lot of danger in doing these close comparisons. Others talk about, there's a scientist who likes to talk about hummingbird prostitutes. Why?
Using categories from human culture and putting those onto animals.
Because the hummingbird male brings a twig for the nest, and the female allows the male to have sex with her. Well, obviously, the people who talk about this have never studied sex workers, prostitution, anything like that, but it's a catchy phrase. We remember it. But it also naturalizes a certain kind of relationship, that males pay females in one way or another for sex, that females don't want to have sex except when they're paid for it. This kind of thinking, it seems to me, gets us into trouble. And one of the surprising things in the research for the book was the influence of these animal shows. I don't know about you, but I grew up on Saturday mornings watching, Animal Planet or one of these nature shows.
Yeah.
And when I heard about the male hyena does X, Y, or Z, I'm thinking, well, I'm a boy. That's what males do.
Yeah.
it actually had a deep-seated influence on me and hundreds of millions of other people, I think, in the world, in a very naive way. But nobody ever bothered to say, the range of behavior among male hyenas is much, much more narrow. Among human males, it's incredibly broad. There's a spectrum that incorporates virtually everything. And so there are some similarities because we're all animals, and we sleep, and we have sex, and we eat, and all these kinds of things, but we're not exactly the same. In fact, we're quite different in important ways.
Yeah, when you get down to the things that set us apart from animals, there are two things you really emphasize. And you've mentioned one already, the fact that humans show a much larger range of characteristic difference. So the hyenas have a stronger concentration of the violence, whereas with human males, there's a much bigger range of people who aren't violent at all to people who are. And also that humans appear to be more malleable, that there's some change that can happen amongst humans, and that we're less likely to see that amongst animals, this idea that animals aren't they don't have, classes to anger management classes for hyenas.
Well, no, but actually speaking of that, it's important. 9 out of 10 murderers, to the extent that we know it, are male. So 9 out of 10, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. That is an important statistic.
Yeah.
That's an important fact to know, particularly if you're interested and concerned about issues of violence of any kind, including gender-based violence. At the same time, my hunch, not knowing you, my hunch is you've never murdered anybody. And I can tell you I've never murdered anybody.
It's a safe bet.
And we have to explain that too. Why have you, as a male, never murdered? Mm-hmm. Why have I? And the fraction that infinitesimal...
Because we're not good at it. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
The infinitesimal number of males who actually have murdered,
right?
At least outside of armies, and that's a whole nother issue of the sanctioned murder of militarization. So we also need to explain why the overwhelming number of men don't murder males.
Yeah. Most murders are by men, and most men aren't murderers.
And that also needs to be explained. If it's so biological, if men are so aggressive by nature, then why aren't more men murderers? That doesn't make sense.
You also apply this to rape, and you bring up the term rape culture, which you have found to be a helpful term because it calls attention to the cultural aspect of rape rather than just chalking it up to some sort of biological outcome of males just being programmed by nature to be inclined to do this.
The highest rape rate, I believe, today, used to be Alaska. I believe it's now Montana in the United States. And you find rates of rape, again, when we know when there are
as
statistics.
Reported.
And there's a lot that is not reported. I acknowledge that. But I don't think it's that there are more reported percentage-wise in Montana than in New Jersey. Is it biologically that the men who happen to live in Montana they have higher rates of testosterone, they're more prone to rape, et cetera, that it's a biological difference between Montana men and New Jersey men? I don't believe that's the case. I believe it is the case there are other factors involved in terms of the role of women in society overall, the level of equality in various kinds of places in the social milieu overall. And it is not a biological fact. Otherwise, you'd find much more standard rates. And if it's biological, you'd find a much higher incidence of murder and rape on the part of the males, as you do among other species where there's a lot more violence. You find generally higher percentages, much higher percentages across species.
See, and when we think this way, we can be more deliberate about what we actually do in response to crimes like rape and murder and violence, because our beliefs about men's propensity to violence affect the policies that we come up with. And there's a great example you bring up in the book from your research about public transportation in Mexico. This is a really helpful way to think about the stakes involved in the stories we tell. So maybe talk a little bit about public transportation in Mexico and some of the policies they came up with that are shaped by the stories that are told about men and violence.
As far as I know, in the United States, there's no segregation by man, woman in public transportation anywhere on subways.
I think there's some Jewish communities that do it where they'll like keep men.
That may
That's
be
the
true.
only, like ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's the only one I could think of.
All right, but not in public transportation.
Sure.
That would be private.
They self-segregate, yeah.
You do in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Bogota, New Delhi, Cairo, and other cities. You find, particularly rush hour, there are separate cars, subway cars, for women and children under 10. And men are not allowed, except in some cases, very old men. But basically, it's cars for women and children, cars for men. Women can decide to go into the men's car or the co-ed car, as it were, but they also have the option for the separation. Most of these are found in the global south. And so the question arises, is the problem of sexual assault in public transportation a graver problem in the global south, or are they actually trying to deal with the problem more effectively in these places? At the same time, and fascinating to me, feminists in various places have opposed, not all feminists, but some feminists have opposed the separation. And the thinking has everything to do with what you believe about male biology. If you think this is just going to happen because boys will be boys, men can't help themselves, or at least a good chunk of men cannot help themselves, if they have the opportunity, they're going to start, touching and leering and saying things to women and making women basically put them under assault of one kind or another, psychological or physical, on these crowded subways. And that's just the way it is, and so we need to separate them. Parenthetically, I would say, I think that is where you get the separation in some of the religious groups. They believe there's a fundamental difference biologically between men and women. In any case, you have feminists coming along saying, look, you wouldn't do this and say, this subway car is for shoplifters, everybody else over here. What we need to do is find the men who are assaulting women, stop them, arrest them, punish them. We need to deal with the core issue here. The fact is, men don't do this by nature. They have been allowed to get away with it. There's an impunity involved because people assume men are going to do this, and therefore it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we need to do is address the problem of violence, gender-based violence on subway cars and everywhere else in society, and take measures to address that problem. So it's a very different view. Is it going to happen no matter what you do, or it's something we can change? And it's not that men do this by nature.
The danger in saying it's by nature is we're more likely to excuse it, to wink at it, to come up with solutions that don't identify the roots of the problem, or even coming to feel resigned to it and giving up the fight against it. You also point out that this kind of segregation, men tend to want to segregate and find male-only spaces for reasons of power, whereas the women who do want that kind of segregation often want it for protection. So you're also sympathetic to like multiple views. I see you saying like you get why some women just want to have their space. They just want to have their train car because they just don't want to have to deal with it. So you're sympathetic to that as well, but you're also saying there's some negative side effects that can come from that and some beliefs that might be informing it that aren't exactly true.
I think it's similar. You could look at it like affirmative action in the United States because of a history of racism in this country, of slavery, genocide, and whatnot. We need to take actual authoritative action to help populations that have suffered from racism and continue to suffer from racism to have access to education, to employment, and whatnot. Do we think that this needs to be that way forever? Well, we would hope not. We would hope that the society could address these systemic problems seriously enough and effectively enough that in the future, at some point, you wouldn't have to do that kind of thing. Similarly, on the trains in Mexico, most people are in favor of the separation. At the same time, you need to address the underlying issues of sexual assault. It reminds me of another example, if I could. I did research on something called sexual exploitation and abuse among United Nations peacekeepers. And I went to Haiti and I went to Lebanon. And there were too many incidents in these places and in other peacekeeping missions around the world of soldiers and police and civilians associated with the UN peacekeepers assaulting girls, women, and sometimes boys, paying them with cookies for sex. Just horrible abuse of their authority in these countries where they were trying supposedly to help people. So we went in and we interviewed all sorts of folks. And one of the interviews that I did was with a Chilean police commander who said, look it, I have my troops from Chile, 3 months without sex with a woman, they can do that. 6 months, that is about the limit, and I have to send them over to the Dominican Republic. This was in Haiti. I have to send them over to the DR so they can get a sexual release over there, and then they can come back. After 6 months, they're out of control. I can't control them anymore. That's human nature. So that the policy implications of believing that men have an absolute biological need to have sex and not have sex with each other, not have sex with themselves or whatever. They have this biological need, and therefore it is justified almost if they are raping women and girls in Haiti, because what are you going to do? They haven't had a chance for sexual release in the Dominican Republic in the allotted time. This kind of public policy, it seems to me, that's driven by belief about male biology is really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, your chapter on the male libido really expands on this. And as you mentioned earlier, some of the stereotypes about women's libidos have been challenged over the past few decades. For example, the idea that women are generally frigid, that they're not into sex, this sort of Victorian view of women not really liking that. That's been debunked in a lot of places. People recognize that some women don't enjoy sex, sure, but others do very much. And so that thinking has started to shift. But when it comes to the male libido, you say we're still operating on the old stereotypes that men are just driven by sex, they're very sexual, high libidos, even to the point of aggression. So we've changed on views of women in some ways, but we're still thinking that men are horny and not very picky. These are some of the stereotypes, and they have big social repercussions, right? You talk about how it pertained to studying birth control in Mexico. Maybe let's talk about that example as it pertains to these stereotypes about the male libido.
So I did a study about vasectomies, male sterilization, and AIDS in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I worked in 2 clinics where they did vasectomies, and I worked in the state-run AIDS clinic. The AIDS patients were overwhelmingly men who had been migrants in the United States and returned home, and then they infected their wives or girlfriends or whatever. But they'd gotten infected as migrants, picking the fruit and vegetables that you and I eat every day here in the U.S. I had spent a lot of time with what they call white coat doctors, and time and again they told me about male libido and male sexuality being one way and female sexuality being another way, and that women are picky and men, they'll have sex with anything that they can have sex with, animal or not. And it was, to me, upsetting that there were these kinds of stereotypes. And then they'd show me these textbooks that had been translated from medical textbooks in the United States, which basically said something similar. So that this was just reinforcing prejudices that they had. But I spent a summer, interestingly enough, in the middle of this research, interviewing indigenous midwives and healers in little villages scattered all over the mountains. Now, these are people who did not have formal education, but they delivered a lot of babies and they did a lot of healing using medicinal plants and whatnot in their communities. And I asked them about 3 questions. I asked them about impotence, infertility, and infidelity. And one of the questions I would ask is, tell me about the differences between male sexuality and female sexuality. Time and again, these people would look at me and say, Matt, don't you think it really depends on the individual a lot more? Why are you trying to generalize for all men are like this sexually, all women are like that sexually? And I would just shake my head and say, well, that's what some of the white coat doctors keep telling me. And they say, That's not my experience. The fact is there are women like this and men like that. And it really depends much more on the individual.
Yeah.
And I think it probably gets you into trouble making these generalizations. But it's so common among the biomedical doctors and practitioners to do this. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to challenge some of the language we use too casually to lump men in one category sexually, aggressively, and all those kinds of things, and base it in supposed biological notions of human behavior.
It seems like such a tricky needle to thread because you're not trying to excuse male violence, male predatory behavior. You're also trying to give it a broader context and expand our ideas about what it means to be a man, what masculinity can mean, and to not just just attribute it all to biology in these really simplistic binary ways. And so, did you feel any anxiety about not coming across as an apologist for male violence or not maybe downplaying it? Like, how did you kind of negotiate that? Because you say like, there's plenty of male violence out there. There's plenty, like, you're not dismissing that. So how did you navigate it?
That wasn't as, I mean, more, I said, if you really want to address questions of violence, you cannot attribute it all to biology. That's not going to solve the problem. So that if we really want to address these things more effectively, we have to understand social and cultural kinds of ideas and influences and practices and institutions. I mean, just to give a basic example, I was born in 1953. So this was 8 years after World War II ended. My father was in World War II. My uncle was in the Korean War. I grew up in a family very, very typical of the time in which the males had gone off to war of one kind or another. And I was steeped in the idea of war growing up. And I played war games with my friends. And the idea of boys do this was very, very natural. So the fact is that when I ask my students at the university, how many of you signed up with the Selective Service when you turned 18? Guess who raises their hands? Only the boys. None of the girls have to register in the United States, nor in 70 other countries where there is conscription. The exceptions are very, very few worldwide. But then I say, how many of you challenge this? Why only boys? The fact is that in the United States and many other countries, but let's just take the U.S., it has been at war of one kind or another for the better part of 100 years in one place or another. The military in the United States plays a fundamental role. Not only is it the largest employer, but it is stationed in 1,000 military bases around the world. And the notion that when I get on an airplane every time, they say military personnel have priority for boarding. Okay, so what does that mean? Why is that?
I think it's our biggest budget line item, too.
Biggest budget line item. But why is the military such an important part of U.S. society in general? And what impact does that have on boys as well as girls growing up in a militarized society? So these are the kinds of questions I would like us to be addressing more carefully, and not simply saying, well, boys are aggressive because they have testosterone and a Y chromosome, and this leads to more violence in the world. There's been no evidence that there's a higher rate of testosterone in the United States than in other countries, but this is the country that invades and occupies other countries more than any other has in the history of humanity.
And this is where you were raised. Do you remember what kind of started cracking the facade? Like, for you, what started challenging your ideas about what it would mean to be a boy or to be a man? Do you remember specific things in your life where you're like, well, hey, maybe it's actually not like that?
Well, I'm not sure. I grew up with a lot of very strong women, and I think that the notion that men are in control, at least at a level of family, never occurred to me, because I just didn't see much evidence for that.
Okay.
Obviously, in the broader society, that may have been true. I think I was awakened politically. Again, I'm from an older generation by Vietnam and the civil rights movement and the black liberation movement of the 1960s and early 70s. And I think I was radicalized politically through those things. And later on, I think I became increasingly aware of questions of gender. But I will say this, I don't think it was until I got to grad school and I was older and I had to pick a topic, and a friend of mine said, why is it only women studying gender? Why aren't there some guys? And I said, that's a really good point. Guys need to be studied too in their gendered aspects and not just take it for granted that when we say gender, that means women. It means men too. And we don't understand nearly as much. And we do take for granted some of the words that we toss out, some of the language about men. And those need to be, I think, examined and critiqued a little bit better.
Yeah, you've been one of the pioneers here, and in producing the show, it has been more tricky to find books that focus on masculinity in ways that I would find acceptable to the show. There's plenty of books that are like pretty stereotypical about men, or that just lean into all the stereotypes. But there are books that really, like your book, that really help expand our thinking about it in productive ways. Again, it's Matthew Gutmann is our guest today, and we're talking about his book, Are Men Animals? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short. He's a professor emeritus of anthropology at Brown University and has spent over 30 years exploring notions of masculinity across places like the United States, Latin America, and China. He's also been a visiting professor at El Colegio de Mexico and Nanjing University. He's written 8 books, and he joins us today from Tiverton, Rhode Island. All right, Matt, I want to talk about your fathering chapter, and you make a case in this chapter that the old divisions of men providing and women nurturing just don't hold up, that this was actually kind of an attempt to manufacture gender roles that kind of was cooked up in the 50s and 60s. You want people to understand more about men as nurturers, because that stereotype that men provide and women nurture excludes men from an important part of relating with children and with other men and with women. And you bring it home with this photo of a man holding a baby. This is a great image. Talk about that photo and what you ended up doing with it to learn more about men as nurturing and as fathers.
So in 1988, I think it was, I was walking through downtown Mexico City, and something caught my eye in a doorway. And this is the old days where I still had a film camera and you didn't have autofocus. So I sort of stuck my head into my camera and I focused as quickly as I could. And I took a picture of this guy holding a baby in a musical instrument store. He was behind the counter. He was talking to a customer. And I developed the photo and I showed it to friends in the U.S. and they said, that's impossible. You say this is a Mexican guy? No, Mexican men are machos. By definition, they don't have anything to do with children. That's women's work. And I said, well, all I know is that I shot it in Mexico City, but I can't tell you any more. And I kept showing it to people in various places. It was like a Rorschach test because it told me more about the people who were commenting than about the photo itself. In the neighborhood of it was a squatter settlement that I lived in with my family for a year in the early 90s. I'd show the photo around and people, the most common response was, me parece normal. It looks normal to me. Why did you take the picture? Do you like mandolins? Because they saw the mandolins hanging on the wall. And I said, no, there's nothing remarkable. They said, not really. Why did you take it? And I showed it to friends who were more academics, and they say, oh, impossible. This must be the boss's child, and she's making him, take care of the, blah, blah, blah. Or he must be indigenous. Maybe he has different customs, but men don't carry babies. This was all middle-class people who told me that kind of thing. Evidence that these guys, for instance, may have had a lot less to do with children than the mothers in these cases. Long story short, after 4 years, I went back and found the guy.
I can't believe this. You found him.
I can't believe it either, because I couldn't remember exactly where it was, and I'm wandering the streets of downtown Mexico City. But I saw some musical instruments on a wall. I said, maybe this is the place. And I go in, and I felt like I was on a cop show. And I showed the
Yeah.
photograph to the woman behind, a young woman
Yeah.
behind the counter. I said, have you seen this man, kind of thing?
Yeah.
And she yelled out, Jose, come here. And the guy comes out, and I had to explain how a photo that I'd taken surreptitiously of him years before had controlled my life ever since.
Yeah.
So the story was that the baby belonged to a neighbor who lived upstairs, and when she went out shopping, she would leave the baby with him because it's much easier to shop if you don't have a baby that you have to care for. He said, and I like kids. I got 3 of my own. What's the big deal? And then he looked at me and he said, gringos, you gringos don't like babies? What's your problem? So he turned the whole thing around on me. And
Yeah,
instead of
what's your
being the macho
problem?
Mexican, it was like, this is pretty common. I mean, what's the
Yeah.
big deal here? Why are you making such a fuss over nothing? In any case, I did do a study of what men do and don't do, and came to the conclusion that at least in the working class, it splits much more. There are some guys who have very little to do with children. There's other guys who that's their definition of masculine and being a man. A good man is being very active as a father. The higher you get socially in Mexico, the less and less men tend to have to do with their children. They have servants who take care of their kids. Their wife doesn't work, and the wife has more to do with the kids. So there was a class element here, which reversed what I thought I was going to find. I thought I'd find, more upper class, more educated, more liberal. The guys are going to be more involved. It was just the opposite. It's just the opposite.
Yeah, we saw the same in the United States. Again, I mentioned the 50s and 60s, that idea of the nuclear family with the man in the workforce and the woman staying home for the kids was really a middle to upper class fantasy or desire, where a lot of lower class people weren't meeting that, and it just wasn't a reality for most Americans. The Leave It to Beaver picture was always the minority, and it even was during the time when today we look back and think that's how the world worked, and it actually didn't really work that way back then either. And so your chapter on fathering is so great because you're trying to argue again, and I think persuasively, that it's not the case that men are naturally the providers, women are naturally the nurturers, but that these are things that culture influences and decisions that societies are making, that individual people are making about how involved men are. And so we can't use the excuse of like, well, men just aren't very good with kids. And so why should we expect them to change the diapers and be as involved as moms are? Moms are just better at it by nature. That's just not true. It's not true according to biology.
No, absolutely. And the fact is, if you look at any agricultural community in the world historically, men would take their little kids out to the fields with them. Maybe more the boys than the girls, but they would take both boys and girls out with them, and the kids would just hang out with the father while he was working the fields. When they moved to the city in the giant migrations of the 20th century, men started getting jobs as factory workers, bus drivers, this and that. They couldn't take the kids with them anymore, and the division of labor, of parenting, fell much more to the woman. And the guy started being the one who was making money, and the division of labor between men and women in many, many households all over the world became much sharper. But we forget history, that this wasn't always the case to nearly the same extent.
Well, Matthew, I mentioned earlier that you'd explored notions of masculinity in different countries, including China, which is a place we haven't touched on yet. And so there's a chapter on this where you're talking about the roles culture can play in shaping gender roles and behaviors. And you bring up examples of social engineering of gender that actually kind of backfired. And you talk about the Cultural Revolution in China. So give us the basics of that situation and some of the problems that they encountered when they tried to kind of mass engineer certain approaches to gender, which seemed more top down than kind of like bottom up.
Let me expand on what you said, because I think it may be a little different. Let me challenge somewhat the premise here. I think there was a lot of top-down engineering that was attempted, but I think that, for instance, the notion that women hold up half the sky, one of the first efforts of the Chinese Revolution in the 50s was toward literacy for women as well as men, and doing away with a lot of very feudal, repressive kinds of social stigma around women doing work that men could also, showing that women could also do the same work as men.
Hmm.
I don't want to back into a whole discussion of the Cultural Revolution, but the fact is that there are a lot of people in China, women who have PhDs today, who are running corporations, and I think that the basis was laid in decades of social transformation. Tumultuous, some of it quite horrible, but nonetheless, I think in a very complicated way, the fact that the literacy rate is so high for men and women in China was one of the keys that allowed the social transformations from the late 70s on. What's happening today with the social engineering of the one-child policy that's now been reversed and whatnot is that there is a vicious retrenchment starting from the government, pushing women to be married and to start having kids, and away from many of the gains that women have made in terms of education, employment, and whatnot. Let me give you an example. There is an official government term for women who are 27 or over and not married. Official government term called leftover women. This is supposed to stigmatize women and say, you are no longer a good woman. You need to be married and start having children. This kind of thing never took place before. There were other problems before. But what is happening now is you have a struggle in China that has its own particular ways of working these kinds of things out that is similar nonetheless in terms of gender confusion and arguments about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, etc. in China. And so that you have, on the one hand, more PhDs than ever before, on the other hand, a government that is trying to enforce laws and regulations that will lead more women to get married earlier and having more and more children, because the one-child policy backfired in many ways. So one of the things I looked at, in addition to the leftover women proclamations from the government and what impact this had, was something called the marriage market, or the blind date corner, which takes place in parks. I spent time in Shanghai in the park, the People's Park there, but you find it in other cities. And parents show up on weekends and they post a flyer, a one-page flyer with information about their daughter or their son, because they're looking for mates. They're trying to find a suitable marriage partner for their son or their daughter. And one of the interesting features is that you have the level of education that would often be comparable between the young men and the young women, as advertised by the parents. At the same time, the ones for the young women would emphasize beauty, and the ones for the young men would emphasize earning power, thus reinforcing what some could call traditional or very old-fashioned ways of thinking about women, that their main selling point is their looks, and the main selling point for the men is whether they have a car, an apartment of their own, and whatnot, and how much they were likely to be earning in the next 20 years while they're having children. So I was very interested in this kind of change over a period of time, where you emerge from a cultural revolution situation in which, officially anyway, women hold up half the sky. Men and women dress very similarly, have very similar kinds of employment, similar salaries for similar kinds of employment, which is not the case in the United States or most countries around the world. And all of a sudden you have a bifurcation, you have a splitting and a re-emphasis on what a woman is and what a man is. And where did that come from? And how did people think about that? And was that a good thing or a bad thing? And did anybody think anything had been lost in the process? But at the same time, you have a lot of struggle going on, because a lot of these PhDs, these young women who are PhDs, they're not getting married. And they're saying, that's not my priority. And the government has less control over them today than it used to. But nonetheless, they make efforts to try to convince more and more women about what is a proper woman today in contemporary China. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
It does make sense because you're talking about China as an example of a place where expectations about gender roles have gone back and forth, and that there have been government efforts, and there are also people, just regular people on the ground, that are trying to make it work or understand gender in different ways. And as you talk about, it's unlikely that Chinese women are going to be turning in their PhDs to get sewing certificates. Like, a lot has happened for some women in China to where that change has been made, but you still do see a sort of regression to these ideas of like what women are good for, like whether they can reproduce and whether they're attractive. So you're still seeing examples of the siloing of people according to gendered expectations that can be really restricting on the options that people have.
And I don't know whether it's relevant, but I've been studying suicide and gendered aspects of suicide in China and the U.S. And one of the fascinating things is that 20, 30 years ago, the population with the highest suicide rate were young, newly married women in the countryside, which is very unusual worldwide because the rates are 3 to 4 times more men than women worldwide commit suicide. And it's not young women committing suicide. That was 30 years ago. Now it's older men in cities. So China is undergoing incredible gender changes in a very compressed period of time. And I think that this is part of it, but people are trying to work out a lot of stuff. And so the young women in the countryside were often oppressed by their mothers-in-law, for instance, living in the households. Sometimes their young husband, would have already migrated to the city. What's happened is that as part of the 200 million plus migration wave from the countryside to the city, these young women have been able to also move to the cities and get away from their mothers-in-law. And they are no longer, they may be facing difficult circumstances in the cities, but it's not as dire as it used to be.
And what's the pressures on men? Like, why are the older men the ones now more likely
It's a great question. In the United States, I'm more familiar with certain studies that have been done of retired middle-class white men who have absolutely no reason for living anymore. And whereas their wives are continuing to do a lot of what made life meaningful, the men all of a sudden have much less and find it much more difficult to sit around and do nothing and be useless to their wives, to their families, to society, and whatnot. And so there's a lot of efforts being made to find activities for these guys to be involved in. I think there may be some similar kinds of things in China because it's older men, is my understanding. It's one of those areas, to the extent that we can trust any statistics. But it may be the men who are less and less employed, who have less and less purpose. But it's shifted now to be more similar to world trends, although it's like 1.5 to 1 for suicide rates of men to women. So it's more men than women, which is the worldwide trend, but it's not 3 or 4 times, which is the worldwide statistic.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I think, again, this speaks to the strength of anthropology as a field, because you can do these cross-cultural comparisons that are accurate about what's happening in each culture and can shed light on what's happening in the United States because we can see some things that are happening in China, or vice versa. So anthropology as a practice and as a study, as a method, can really help open our eyes about what it means to be gendered, what gender is, and what it means to be a human.
And in my case, I depend on the people who do the surveys. I don't do the surveys myself, but I need to read them. I need to understand if what I'm finding, talking to, 20 people over and over and over, how that fits into larger trends that may be revealed through surveys, for instance.
And I think if there's one recurring message throughout your book, it's that you don't want our ideas about men, or the stories we tell about them, to let men off the hook. You don't want beliefs about biology to prevent discussions of how things could be better. So maybe we'll close with another example from you about how men are kind of being let off the hook right now and what you'd like to see happening instead.
So if I were to sit here and make a comment about a woman doing something or thinking something because she's a woman. My guess is you would be skeptical. You'd want to know a little bit more about what I'm talking about. If I said the same thing about a man, you might be a little less skeptical, because I think it's still common. If this human being is male, we know some things about this human being by virtue of this person being male. And I think, among scholars of masculinities, we started off saying, hey, it's not just one masculinity, it's plural masculinities. There's all sorts of different ones. And I've got a list of over 100 adjectives that scholars have been using in recent years to describe this kind of masculinity, that kind of masculinity, some other kind of masculinity. Everybody's got to invent a new term and become the next famous, scholar of masculinity, because I've got the brilliant new adjective. And okay, fine and dandy, I get it. I've done the same, whatever. But here's the problem I have. Each and everything that you do and think in your life today, does that automatically have to do with masculinity? Is that the only way to describe you as a human being?
Yeah.
Is the glasses you have reflect some kind of masculinity? The shirt you have on today reflects some kind of masculinity. What I see in the background has to do with your, what you did before, what you're going to do after the interview has to do with your kind of masculinity. The three adjectives that would best describe your masculinity. We don't do that for women to nearly the same extent. We don't adjectify, whatever the term would be, absolutely every behavior and thought and whatnot. That's anathema to us. That's reducing somebody to simply their body.
It happens, but it's less,
it does
less likely.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, then it's, yeah.
I think it's been, let me qualify that. It's been more challenged, and correctly so.
Right,
It needs to be still more challenged.
Yeah, that's how you say it in the book too, yeah.
It's less challenged with men. So I think we let men off the hook precisely by making everything that a man does, or a self-identified male does, some kind of masculinity. And that's the only explanation that we can find. And it doesn't always work. I think it's a helpful concept. I've spent my entire career developing the concept with, thousands and tens of thousands of others.
Yeah.
But I also think that it can get us into trouble if we think that in and of itself is going to explain everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's, in one sense, masculinity has been such a focus for you, so you're a specialist on identifying it, but you're also a specialist enough to know that it doesn't need to be the most special thing about any particular person. And you're inviting us to not essentialize by gender. And as we kind of mentioned at the top, that's even more important the more we become familiar with non-binary folks and genderqueer folks that don't fit these neat categories. So masculinity is a useful category, but it's a great reminder that it's not the only category, and it's not the predominant category. It doesn't have to be, and we shouldn't essentialize it to biology, to our animal selves. Yes, we're animals, but we're also humans, and that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be afraid of gender, but I don't think that gender is a simple concept.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can explain everything through gender. I think it can be useful, but we can also overdo it.
It's Matthew Gutmann, and we're talking about the book, Are Men Animals? How Modern Masculinity Sells Men Short. And Matthew, we always like to close with regrets, challenges, and surprises. So this is an opportunity for you to speak to one, two, or all three of those things. Anything you would change about the book now that it's out, what the most challenging thing about writing it was, or something that surprised you during the course of writing this book.
I think the most challenging was coming to accept that men are animals, women are animals, and so what? In other words, what did that actually mean? What did that entail? What did that imply? And trying to figure out how to define the animality of men and what that had to do with how society organizes itself. In terms of what I'd change, I've never written anything, a book or an article, that I haven't later said, oh, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done that.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know any writer or speaker who hasn't had some of those qualms. At the same time, it's out. I'm not thrilled about the cover of the book, which, this being a podcast, you're not going to see.
Yeah.
I argued, they said, oh, it'll sell more copies. I'm not convinced, but that's what the publisher
It has
thought.
a bone on it and it's red.
Yeah, like a dog bone. Anyway, I think I underestimated the moment of animal fever in the world. I mean, the trend is all the other direction, and that is finding similarities between humans and non-human and appreciating that. And I have all but one of my kids is a vegetarian. So I am very acutely aware of that. I don't know how I could have rewritten the book, because I'm sort of taking the opposite stance, and that is, yes, we're animals, but we get into trouble if we do simplistic comparisons between humans and non-humans. And it leads us to believe things that really let men off the hook and don't get to the heart of the matter. So I don't know. I mean, if there's a second edition, I think I might try to figure out how to nuance some of that a little better.
Yeah, you could knock that out in a new preface that just says what you just said. Like, hey, this is a trend. People love thinking about this, and there are some interesting similarities. The point of this book is to, again, introduce that bioskepticism, to say, let's pause for a minute and actually unpack what we're talking about. Or maybe you just have millions of people listen to this episode and problem solved.
There we go.
Well, Matthew, this has been great, man. Thanks for joining us and talking about the book.
Thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Matthew. And let's send everybody off with some smooth jazz for all my low T bros listening out there. Thank you for listening to Relationscapes. Testosterone levels are dropping as we speak, I know. But that's why I'm releasing my brand new supplement, T-Boned. You can get your boost of T all day long with this amazing capsule of manliness. It's guaranteed to offset all the jazz music you know and love. You can go to my website and buy it right now. Use the promo code BONED for 5% off your first 12-month T-Bone subscription. These statements have not been evaluated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. T-Bone is not a medical product, and it guarantees nothing, and it doesn't actually work. If you like this episode or this conversation, you can check out other masculinity episodes on Relationscapes. There's Detoxing Masculinity with Ronald Levant and Shayna Pryor. There's Black and Beyond the Binary with K.B. Brookins. Masculinity More Liberated and Free with Frederick Joseph. Or Mike Pope's episode, Learning About Today's Masculinity from the Ancient Romans. Links to those episodes are in the show notes. And now all of you, would you please just man up in your man caves and rate and review this man show in Apple Podcasts. You can also rate it in Spotify as well. Mates of State provides our Dude Bro theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you again right after I get back from the gym.